right, next up we have Amelia Terry, who's a doctoral student in the School of Public Health, and I am really excited about this one because there's just so little research about the LGBT. Thank you. So I'm really excited, and I will let her take the stage.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me if I stand? Am I hearable? Okay. All right, if I forget to change the slide, please yell at me, because I'm nervous. I'll get caught up in my notes. Yell at me. My name is Amelia Terry. I'm a first-year doctoral student in the UNLV School of Public Health. Thanks. And today I'm going to be discussing problem gambling within Nevada's LGBTQIA+ community. So a few learning objectives today. We'll be learning about problem gambling in the LGBT community, as well as learning about issues impacting this community on a local and national level, and a little bit about what the literature says. We'll also be discussing the extent of problem gambling within Nevada's LGBT community. So the definition of problem gambling that I worked off of is that problem gambling is an addictive but treatable disorder characterized by the uncontrolled continuation of gambling behaviors despite adverse effects such as disruption to family, personal, or job-related pursuits. I include this as a reminder to myself, problem gambling warning signs, just to highlight a couple. For the gambler, it's being unable to stop playing regardless of winning or losing, or gambling until the last dollar is gone. And for loved ones, some of these observations of the gambler could be observing emotional distress, anger, depression. Maybe they have withdrawn recently from the family and there's a lack of communication there. So to give some background and significance of the extent of this problem gambling in the United States impacts 2 million adults, and that's roughly 1% of the population, that present with severe gambling problems that would likely result in a clinical diagnosis of pathological gambling. 4 to 6 million adults in the United States, or 2 to 3%, exhibit mild to moderate symptoms of problem gambling behavior. And while gambling can affect anyone, problem gambling rates are higher in males, racial and ethnic minority individuals, and lower income individuals. But it's important to note that this does not exist in a vacuum. The literature suggests, for example, that experiencing racial discrimination is a risk factor for problem gambling, and that it may be a coping method or response to social trauma. Additionally, problem gambling is significantly associated with individuals who have a lower level of education, individuals who report experiencing moderate levels of psychological distress. It's often a trauma response to PTSD. For example, experiencing abuse in childhood is a risk factor for developing a problem gambling issue later in life. Individuals who partake in daily tobacco use, there's an association there. In addition, problem gamblers tend to have much higher rates of suicidality. We heard earlier, I said earlier rather, that 2 to 3% of the population may present with a mild to moderate problem gambling issue. However, problem gambling may impact up to 6% of Nevadans. And we heard in the last presentation from Tony that this is like 4 T-Mobile stadiums and then some. So it's a pretty significant issue here. So to give some background and bear with me here, I'm just making sure I didn't mess up the slides. No, we're good, okay. Just some background and significance regarding COVID-19. It's important to situate our study within the COVID-19 pandemic in its context because that's when we launched our study. As we know, COVID-19 has led to record level unemployment levels. Millions of households are experiencing food and housing insecurity, and sexual and gender minority individuals, communities of color, and families with children are facing disproportionate impacts. Increased rates of mental health disorders include anxiety, depression, suicide ideation, and substance use. And for sexual and gender minority people, communities of color, women, immigrants, and households with children, they're facing some of the worst overall mental health outcomes. With regard to Nevada, COVID-19, as we know, it hit our state pretty hard, one of the hardest states in the country. 40% of jobs lost were in the hospitality, leisure, and retail space. In June 2020, although casinos have reopened or are at least starting to reopen, maybe they've all completely reopened. I know the Palms recently reopened. Are there any that are still closed? I'm not sure. I think there are actually. Experts warn that Nevada's economy is going to take years to completely recover. I want to pivot to talking about the LGBTQIA+ community. LGBTQIA+, for those who are not aware, is an acronym for Sexual and Gender Minority Individuals, SGM, which is an acronym I'll be using a lot in this presentation, who identify as part of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, or transgender, two-spirit, queer, intersex, and asexual community. 4.5% of the US population, over 11 million individuals, identifies within the LGBT community. And 25% of LGBT people make less than $24,000 per year compared to 18% of the general population. So that's a disparity right there. 27% of LGBT individuals experience food insecurity versus 15% of the general population. Minority stress theory, as it pertains to the LGBT community, is that health disparities can largely be explained by stressors such as stigma, discrimination, and harassment that many LGBT people deal with on a daily basis. Therefore, extremely high rates of stigma-related mental illness, such as suicidality and anxiety, compared to the general population can be attributed to minority stress. Gender diverse individuals and LGBT people of color are disproportionately impacted, with the latter experiencing minority stress stemming from both racism and homophobia. Negative impacts of poverty on mental health are well documented, and all of these issues were brought into high relief during COVID-19. For LGBT individuals, COVID-19 increased depression, PTSD, and general worry. SGM people have been unduly impacted by COVID-19 and have experienced greater rates of job loss, housing insecurity, and other hardships, as well as an increase in mental health problems. All of this sets the stage and context for our study evaluating problem gambling within the LGBT community here in Nevada. So what do we know about this population and problem gambling? The answer is not very much. We don't know a lot about the LGBT community as a whole, though. Research on problem gambling among LGBT individuals is scarce, and the findings are mixed. One study says that pathological gambling may be more common in gay and bisexual men versus heterosexual men, and is often comorbid with other addictive behaviors. Problem gaming, rather, and internet use, but not gambling, may be overrepresented in sexual minorities. And as we heard in the last presentation, there's a pretty thin line there. Another study, lesbian, gay, bisexual college student athletes reported problem gambling scores that were approximately 2.5 to 3.5 times higher than their heterosexual peers. And lastly, transgender and gender diverse individuals, and transgender women in particular, may be at an elevated risk for pathological gambling. So Nevada is actually the third most LGBTQIA+ populated state in the United States, and 5.5% of Nevadans identify as part of the SGM community. 52% of LGBT Nevadans identify as ethnic or racial minorities. However, we don't have much data on LGBT Nevadans overall, nor do we understand the prevalence of problem gambling in our state. To try and rectify this, we launched a community needs assessment survey late last year. The LGBT Community Needs Assessment Survey was developed by the UNLV School of Public Health's LGBTQIA+ research team using validated measures. An online Qualtrics survey was launched November 2021 during the height of Omicron. The goals of this survey were to fill in knowledge gaps. As we mentioned before, little is known about LGBT Nevadans. Another goal was to better understand the critical issues impacting this community from a pandemic context, such as mental health, housing, food insecurity, and problem gambling. Lastly, the goal is to develop resources and action plans or interventions surrounding emergent themes. So in order to recruit participants, we created 2 flyers. This is an example of the one that was more geared toward the Southern Nevada market. And flyer distribution was really contingent on leveraging relationships with our community partners. Thankfully, we had a lot of organizations that were willing to collaborate with us and spread the word to their populations that they serve in order to increase participant response rate. So I know for me personally, I gave flyers to all my friends and family, and I said, please, if you see a Starbucks bulletin board, put one up. So we got the word out there, and this really involved leveraging relationships with public health, nonprofit, and county service providers and professionals based in Las Vegas, Reno, and Pahrump. As of April, 375 participants have started the survey, and 332 participants answered the gambling questions. The mean age of these participants is 31, and 31% identified as Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish in origin. 33% reported having a disability, and 4% reported an HIV diagnosis. I'm now going to speak more specifically to some of the demographic questions that we answered to give you an idea of our participants. Regarding sexual orientation, 24% identified as gay, 23% identified as bisexual, 20% identified as queer, 13% lesbian, 7% asexual, 7% something else, something else that was not included in our survey choices, 4% identified as straight, and 3% identified as questioning. With regard to gender identity, 35% identified as female, 28% identified as male, 20% identify as genderqueer, gender nonconforming, or gender non-binary. 8% identify as transgender men, 5% identify as transgender women, and 3.6% identify as another gender identity that was not included in the survey. As far as race, 58% of respondents were white, 15% were some other race not specified in the survey, 10% identified as Asian, 8% Black or African American, 5% American Indian or Alaska Native, and 3% Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander. The education finding is super interesting because 50% of our population have at least a bachelor's degree, and this is excluding those who have completed an associate's degree or completed some college but did not finish. So this is a very highly educated sample. However, despite being such a highly educated sample, 22% of respondents indicated making less than $10,000 a year. 70% are employed. Using several validated mental health measures, we found that 88% of our population reported moderate to high stress levels. 68.5%, almost 70%, met the diagnostic criteria for depression. With regard to generalized anxiety disorder, 53% met the diagnostic criteria for moderate to severe anxiety. And staggeringly, almost 50% of our population reported serious suicidal ideation. My part of this project was specifically to look at problem gambling. I chose to use the validated NORC diagnostic screen for gambling problems, self-administered, NODSA. It consists of 10 yes or no questions that we'll be going more into detail with here in a second. The scoring criterion, answering yes to 1 to 2 questions, may indicate a mild risk for having a gambling problem, but would not meet a clinical pathological gambling diagnosis. Answering yes to 3 to 4 questions may indicate problem gambling, but not necessarily a clinical diagnosis. Answering yes to 5 or more questions indicates severe problem gambling and would likely result in a clinical diagnosis of pathological gambling. So for the first question, have there ever been periods where you needed to gamble with increasing amounts of money or with larger bets than before in order to get the same feeling of excitement? 4.6% said yes. Have you ever felt restless or irritable when trying to stop, cut down, or control gambling? 3.7% said yes. Have you ever tried and not succeeded in stopping, cutting down, or controlling your gambling 3 or more times in your life? 2.6% said yes. Have you ever gambled to escape from personal problems or to relieve uncomfortable feelings such as guilt, anxiety, helplessness, or depression? 7.5% said yes. Has there ever been a period when, if you lost money gambling one day, you would often return another day to get even? 5.2% said yes. Have you lied to family members, friends, or others about how much you gamble and/or about how much money you lost on gambling on at least 3 occasions? 4.3% said yes. Have you ever written a bad check or taken money that didn't belong to you from family members, friends, or anyone else in order to pay for your gambling? 2% said yes. Has your gambling ever caused serious or repeated problems in your relationships with any of your family members or friends? Or has your gambling ever caused you problems at work or in your studies? 1.7% said yes. Have you ever needed to ask family members, friends, a lending institution, or anyone else to loan you money or otherwise bail you out of a desperate money situation that was largely caused by your gambling? 2% said yes. And lastly, have there ever been periods lasting 2 weeks or longer where you spent a lot of time thinking about gambling experiences, planning out future gambling ventures or bets, or thinking about ways of getting money to gamble with? And 4.6% said yes. Given the relatively high rates of suicidality both in the LGBT community and that are associated with problem gambling, we specifically wanted to look at problem gambling behaviors and a link between suicidality within our population. So for the question regarding have there ever been periods lasting 2 weeks or longer when you spent a lot of time thinking about your gambling experiences, planning out future gambling ventures or bets, or thinking about ways of getting money to gamble with, compared with those who answered no, those who answered yes had a 2.1 point increase in suicidality scores. Additionally, have you ever written a bad check or taken money that didn't belong to you from family members, friends, or anyone else? Compared with those who answered no, those who answered yes had a 3.3 point increase in suicidality scores. Lastly, have you ever needed to ask family members, friends, or a lending institution or anyone else to loan you money? Compared with those who answered no, those who answered yes had a 2.6 point increase in suicidality scores. So our key findings overall are that 5.7% of respondents answered yes to 1 to 2 questions, which seems on par with the 6% that we talked earlier about Nevadans maybe experiencing problem gambling. However, 2.7% of the respondents answered yes to 5 or more questions, which again is the more severe category that would in turn likely lead to a diagnosis of pathological gambling. Again, 2.7% of respondents versus 1% of the general population. LGBTQ people in our sample were almost 3 times as likely to experience severe problem gambling. Therefore, it may disproportionately impact LGBT Nevadans. It's important to note some limitations to our study. We had a very small sample size, and the survey was distributed in an electric format, which, basically people without smartphones or computers were unable to take it because it was electronic. The survey was only available in English. And then something important is that 58% of our respondents were white, but national estimates indicate that 52% of LGBT Nevadans identify as people of color. So we need to focus recruitment efforts to better reach participants of color. There's also selection bias there also may be selection bias in our sample in that those who answered may not reflect the general population. For example, the study emerged sort of at a university level, and a lot of us leveraged our contacts, so that may not speak to the population as a whole. Lastly, survey distribution was more rigorous in Southern Nevada, so there's a great need to reach out more to Northern Nevada as well as more rural areas. So the conclusion and some next steps. Problem gambling may be overrepresented in LGBT Nevadans, and certain gambling behaviors are associated with increased suicidality in this population. There's a need to develop culturally competent resources and train mental health professionals on LGBT issues. There's also a need to increase outreach to LGBT spaces, as well as to collaborate with community partners to implement inclusive Gamblers Anonymous chapters or other interventions within LGBT hubs and safe spaces. These are my references. And I also would really like to thank my mentor, Dr. Jennifer Farr, as well as the Nevada Council on Problem Gambling that made this whole project possible. So thank you.